So, as I said last week, this is going to be the way we're going to move forward for this term with these video lectures. What's going to happen is, as I explained in our first class meeting, the expectation is that you're going to read the chapter in the textbook and watch the video lecture before you take the quiz. And then again, at the end of each video lecture is the link or the information about either the video or movie that you are expected to watch or the article that you are expected to read for discussion, as well as some questions to potentially guide your reflection. So again, you're going to watch this before class on January 21st in this particular term, and then you're going to take the quiz in that first half hour of class, and then come to class to discuss and also ask any questions you have about the content and the film. This week it's going to be a video that we're watching. The questions on the quiz are from the book, the lecture, and the video that you're going to watch. And I will at some point during this video give you the answer to one quiz question. So you're going to want to pay attention for that because that's a freebie. And given that there's only 10 questions on the quiz, that's 10% of your quiz mark if you pay attention and listen to it. So when we think about adolescence, we have to obviously start at the beginning. And there are three big things that happen. We have the biological transitions, the cognitive transitions, and the social transitions. And those really set the stage for everything else we're going to be talking about throughout the term. So again, in your book, they refer to it as the fundamental changes of adolescence, the biological, cognitive, and social transitions. And of course, puberty, which is the heart of the biological transitions, is in a lot of ways the biggest marker that we get of adolescence. It's the one change that is evident to other people. So other people can see when you have gone through your growth spurt. They can see for adolescent girls when they're starting to develop breasts and other secondary sex characteristics. They can see for adolescent boys as they've gone through their growth spurt, as they start to build on additional muscle, as they start to grow facial hair, their voice deepens. So that's the part of adolescence and a part of these fundamental changes that happen that other people see. A lot of the other things that happen, so the cognitive changes and the social transitions, those are things that happen inside of us. And when we're talking to someone else, they might see the evidence of the cognitive transition, so the way that our thoughts change, the way that we're able to organize our thinking and plan ahead changes. And the social transitions, there may be visible parts, particularly as we explore who we are, and we may try on some different ways of being, and that might include different ways of dressing or different ways of doing hair or makeup. And that might be evident, but it's still not going to be as evident universally as puberty is. And so that's where we're going to start. And so I've already sort of gotten to what happens. So we have these three chief physical manifestations of puberty. So three main things that happen that people see happening. The first is this rapid acceleration of growth. So we'll talk about it in a few minutes as the adolescent growth spurt, but one of the things that happens during puberty as puberty kicks off is we see people grow significantly taller than they were, and we also see weight gain that occurs. We also then have the development of the primary sex characteristics, and so those are the ones that we can't really see. That's further development of the gonads. The gonads are in females, the ovaries, in males, the testes, and that also kickstarts some of the hormonal changes that we see happening. Or actually, the hormonal changes are what kickstart the development of the gonads, to be quite honest. And then the development of those secondary sex characteristics. So those are things like facial hair, breasts, underarm and pubic hair. And that happens towards the end of puberty. And that's when all of this happens together. When we emerge from that, we have more of our adult body and adult features. So how does this all happen, or why does this all happen? Well, the endocrine system is highly involved. So we're not going to go too deep into the biology. There's certainly more in your text that I am strongly encouraging that you read, but definitely the endocrine system is in charge of hormones, and hormones are, of course, what kick off puberty. And the big feedback loop that's important for puberty is what's known as the HPG axis. And so HPG is hypothalamus, pituitary, and gonads. And so our hypothalamus, which is in our brain, sends out this message to our pituitary glands that says it's time. Okay, so how does it determine that it's time? Well, based on a couple of factors. Part of it is just simply genetic. So part of it, if your parents, if your mother was an early mature, you might get the signal earlier than someone else. If your mother or your father was early, if your mother or father was a later mature, your signal might come a little bit later. It's also going to be influenced by things like your nutrition, which might sound a little weird, but basically when we think about it, what puberty is getting us ready for is to be able to reproduce, because from a purely biological level, the reason we're here is to reproduce. And puberty is what makes us able to do that, because it's the development of the primary and secondary, well, essentially really the primary sex characteristics. The secondary are just sort of window dressing, if you will. But in order for that to happen, for a female to be able to carry a baby to term, she needs to have a sufficient amount of fat available, because that creates some insulation. And also, her body needs to know that there's a steady supply of food, because that growing fetus needs food and nutrition. Same from an evolutionary standpoint for males. You might be thinking, okay, males don't need the fat to indicate to their body that they're ready to produce sperm. But again, men have to be able to have that nutritional base, so to speak, for their body to say, okay, there is a steady supply of food. This person is ready to become a parent, become a father, and be able to provide food for their offspring. So that's just taking it back to sort of a very basic level and why that's important. And so one of the signals to our bodies and to our hypothalamus that we're ready is that we have sufficient nutrition and sufficient fat stores to start the process of puberty. So then the pituitary gland gets the message of release the gonads. And the gonads, so the ovaries and the testes, that's where our androgens and estrogens are stored. So those are, of course, the hormones that we think of mostly. Androgens for males, testosterone is what we think of, and the estrogens for females, that guide our bodies through puberty. It's important to note that both males and females do have both androgens and estrogens in their bodies, but for females, it is a higher percentage of estrogens. For males, it's a higher percentage of androgens. So that is just something to keep in mind. Okay, another aspect also that triggers the HPG axis is actually exposure to light. And part of that, again, comes from an evolutionary standpoint of exposure to light meant you were heading into the sort of planting and harvesting season, which meant there would be food. If it's darkness all the time, how do you feed a baby? So our bodies are really pretty hardwired in pretty smart ways. That's why we're still here. And that really hasn't changed. What has changed is the age of onset of puberty. Because as we have moved into, first of all, much more food security and food availability, we've seen that the age at which people begin puberty has dropped. And also exposure to light, well, some of that happens with artificial lighting as well, right? So there's obviously natural sunlight is what our body is most attuned to, but we actually have lights that mimic natural sunlight. A lot of people use that for the treatment of seasonal affective disorder. So we know that some of these artificial lights can also indicate to our bodies, like, oh yeah, there's enough light, you're good to go. Of course, the hardwiring in our body doesn't know that we could all pick up our phones and hit up DoorDash or skip the dishes right now and boom, food will magically appear. But we live in a time of abundance of food for most people, and we'll maybe touch on that a little later in the course. Particularly, I think when we talk about social transitions, we'll talk a little bit about that. So, this rapid acceleration of growth, this somatic development, so that's the changes in our body that we see happening with puberty. And as I mentioned already, we have this dramatic increase in height and weight. In fact, during the adolescent growth spurt, the growth rate is similar to that of a toddler. So one of the things that is really kind of fascinating is, when babies are born, they're 7, 8 pounds on average, right? Some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller. And then all of a sudden, they're like 3 years old and 30 pounds or more than that. And it's like, what? Whoa, how did that, that's a lot of weight gain. And it's because toddlers do a lot of growing very quickly in terms of both height and weight. And then we see that again during the adolescent growth spurt. So what we also see is adolescents who kind of look like, my best comparison is like golden retriever puppies, where their limbs are too long and they can't quite control themselves, because the growth, when we go into a growth spurt, it's our hands and our feet and our heads that grow first, which is also why if you really look at a toddler, you'll be like, oh yeah, they kind of are not so proportional, because they're not. And then the rest of the body catches up, and then the balance and coordination catches up also. But there's that period of adolescent awkwardness where adolescents are just sort of flopping around a little bit as they're going through the growth spurt. Part of why we go through this growth spurt as well is to pack on fat. So I just explained why fat is important for both males and females. But what we also see happening for males is we see that males are now able to build more muscle. Females are also able to build more muscle, but not as much. This is that difference again where males have more of the androgens, the testosterone, which helps with muscle development and muscle growth. Females have some, but not as much. And females do tend to gain more fat during puberty because, again, biologically, that's what we need in order to reproduce. Okay. Typically, girls enter their growth spurt about 2 years earlier than boys. So if any of you have parents like mine who saved everything, go back and look at your old class pictures from elementary school. And what you'll notice probably is in like grades 1 through about grade 4, you have several girls who are standing in the back row, but a lot of the girls are sitting in the front row, and boys make up most of the middle row and most of the back row. And then like grades 5 through 8, we see a little shift in that. And all of a sudden, the boys are all in front and the girls are in back, because the girls have started going through their growth spurt. And the girls get taller than the boys, which the boys don't usually like very much. But that's okay, because when their growth spurts kick in, the girls have stopped growing and they shoot past them. So again, if you look at like grade 11 and 12 class pictures, we're back to girls in front, boys in back. So prior to puberty, we don't see a tremendous difference between girls and boys' heights. We tend to see that boys are a little bit taller, but not a whole lot. And then early in puberty, girls go through their growth spurt, they get taller, but then boys catch up and take the lead back as they head into adulthood. Now, sexual maturation. Obviously, this is an important part of puberty as well. And I'm going to direct you to the Tanner stages in your textbook. So there's a table on page 21, table 1.1, and I'll just sort of flash it for a sec here. And this just tells us sort of the rough ages and the characteristics that happen during puberty. So again, for girls, they could be starting as early as the age of 7 with breast development and breast growth. And then for boys, starting at around age 10. And again, that's on the earlier side, and the age ranges are pretty big. So for girls, growth of breasts happens anywhere between the ages of 7 and 13. So you can have someone who is an early maturer who is finished with all of puberty before a late maturer has even started. The same is true for boys, but it is a shorter range. Boys typically, again, early maturers at around age 10, late maturers starting at like 13 and a half. So we're only talking about like a 3.5 year span for boys. We're talking about a 6 year span for girls in terms of the onset, the beginning of puberty. And then on pages 22 and 23, you'll actually see sort of the visuals of the Tanner stages. And again, this is what tells us where an adolescent or a child, because if they're starting at 10 or 11, they're still a child, in terms of where they are in terms of their development. So that's just something to take a look at depending on sort of where you end up or what field you end up in. You may hear more or less about the Tanner stages. One of the things that is also tricky about, the growth spurt and sexual maturation is that for females in our society, they appear physically mature long before they're actually consistently fertile. So the onset of menstruation, of course, is the first indication that an adolescent girl is becoming fertile, but usually it takes a good year, 2, sometimes even 3, for a female to have their cycle regulate itself and become regular. And it's only when their menstrual cycle is really regular that they're actually fertile. But the problem is they've already finished all of the other development and they look physically mature. And that can sometimes get them into trouble because people assume they're older than they are. And so older adults, not like senior citizen adults, but just adults who are significantly older than them, may look to them for sexual relationships that they're really not ready for. Whereas for males, typically it's a little different, right? They're not physically mature before they're fertile. They actually they can ejaculate with semen and impregnate someone before they even have their full adult body. Okay. So in terms of the timing and tempo, I've already talked about this a little bit. There's tremendous variation in both the timing of the onset, so that's the timing of puberty, and then the tempo, which is the duration of puberty. And so with the Tanner stages that I just introduced you to, they said around 7 to 13 for girls for starting with breast development, 10 to 13 and a half for boys. But they do find that some children can actually begin, some girls can begin as young as 5 years old with breast development, and some boys as young as 6. Now, the whole process for girls from start to finish can take anywhere from 1.5 to 6 years. And for boys, again, we have that truncated range of 2 to 5 years. And it is impossible to tell by looking at someone how long it's going to take them to get from step 1 to the end of puberty. It's also impossible by looking at someone to know at what age they're going to start puberty. There are so many factors that impact the timing. So again, I mentioned earlier genetics, access to resources, particularly to food. Then we also think about activity level, so high-level athletes. So gymnasts in particular, figure skaters are another group, runners, cross-country runners. Those are athletes who oftentimes have delayed onset of puberty, dancers as well, ballet dancers, because it's really hard to do ballet if you have full breast development. It totally throws off all of your sense of where you are and how you move through space. And so what we often see is people who are very serious in those sorts of athletic endeavors, they may have quite delayed onset of puberty, also in part because they're not allowing their bodies to build up enough fat to signal that it's time to get started. One of my friends, I remember, was quite a serious dancer when she was younger. And then it was towards the end of high school or maybe even her first year of university, she actually broke her foot, and that was the end of her dance career. And she said it was like overnight, her body was like, okay, now it's time, it's go time. And like everything changed, because as soon as she stopped working out and dancing at the level she was at and actually feeding her body more, her body was like, okay, we've been waiting for this. So that genetic signal can be there and be ready to go, but it needs to have the other conditions met as well to make it actually happen. So this is also, for those of you who haven't had me in class before, this is often what happens. I sort of get ahead of myself. So I've already talked quite a bit about the genetic and environmental influences on pubertal timing, but let's take a look at it in a little more detail. So again, individual differences are certainly going to play a part, genetics and the environment. Familial influences, so the influences of our family, and stress can be a factor here, right? So if you think about, and we're not just talking like individual stress, like, oh, you're stressed out about exams, or you're stressed out because you and your parents aren't getting along very well, but stress within the family unit. So this is one of those things that we have to also consider, is what's happening in the family unit as a whole, and what's happening to the family as a whole. Is there insecure housing? Is there insecure access to resources? Is there marital conflict? Is there a family member with a serious physical or mental illness that uses up a lot of the resources and emotional resources of the family? All of those things can play a role in addition to the regular adolescent-parent conflict that often happens. Group differences, so I've already talked about the role of nutrition, and that plays a large role globally. So we're going to see pretty big differences in the onset of puberty in different areas of the world based on food scarcity and food availability. So that is a factor as well. And then we have what's known as the secular trend. And the secular trend is the tendency over the last 20 years or so for people to be larger in stature and to reach puberty earlier because of improved nutrition and improved health, right? So if you think about like a couple hundred years ago, when people basically peed and pooped into a bucket and then tossed it out their window into the street, because that's what actually happened before we had like sewage and running water. Health was a little sketchy, right? And so if you weren't physically well, your body couldn't spend its resources having you go through puberty. So it got delayed a little. When things like the plague was out there circulating, we would see puberty rates, be a little bit older. But now we've got, again, for the most part, and it's sad to say that we live in Canada, we live in a country with plenty, and yet several of our Indigenous groups live without clean running water, without access to clean running water. I'm going to try not to get too political as we go through the class, but I am also going to say, it's not all fabulous. We don't have the best track record as Canadians of taking care of the people who we stole a bunch of land from. So we kind of have to get better at that, right? And so we would see differential rates of age at puberty between people who grow up in a city with access to healthcare, with clean running water, with plenty of food, and people who live on, let's say, a reserve in the northern part of the country without running water, without access to healthcare, without access to the same food. One of the things that we don't really think about is we walk into a grocery store and it's like, it's February, but I really want some tomatoes, and there are tomatoes there. But if you live in Nunavut and go to the grocery store in February, guess what there isn't? Any fresh produce, right? It's all canned or frozen because that's what they can get up there at that time of year. And so nutritionally, there's going to be some differences as well. Okay, so the secular trend we do see as being more pronounced in girls, and that's, again, largely because girls need to have those fat stores in order to start menstruating. So as girls have been having over the last many years more access to things, that has happened. But nutrition, sanitation, and the overall development of infrastructure. So all of those play roles. Okay, so at this point, I see something highlighted on my notes. And what I see highlighted on my notes is that the answer to question 9 on your quiz. So the quiz that you're going to have at the end of this chapter, essentially, the answer to question 9 is A. That's all you need to know. The answer to question 9 is A. And let's move on now to consider the psychological and social impact of puberty. So in terms of the more immediate impacts, puberty and self-esteem, probably not a shock that self-esteem, particularly for females, tanks around the time of puberty. What is interesting, that it seems to be especially white girls who have a huge drop in self-esteem. And that, of course, is connected to what our society's expectations are and what our cultural expectations are for other groups. We put so much pressure as a society, not as individuals, on particularly white girls to look a certain way. When you look at magazine covers, when you look at movies, when you look at posters, when you look at TV shows, we see these flawless, skinny, and yet busty white women by and large. And what we see when we see people of color who are lucky enough to get every time a person of color is on a magazine cover, it's like, oh my gosh, Vogue just published, and it's like, why is this not the norm? Why is it not the norm that people of color grace the cover of Vogue and other magazines, right? And so on the one hand, yay that we're celebrating it and becoming aware that it's not a commonplace occurrence, but the bigger question should be, why isn't it a commonplace occurrence? But I digress. But what we see for people from other cultural groups, and particularly for some people of color, is a celebration of a more healthy and maybe even natural body than we see for white people. So for white girls in particular, in adolescence, we see a huge tank of self-esteem. Part of it is because society basically says to white girls, unless you're pretty, you're not really worth much. And in other cultures, and for a lot of people of color, their cultures actually say, like, you are more than your looks. And so if you have more pieces that tie into your self-esteem, if one aspect takes a hit, you have other pieces to keep lifting you up. So that's another thing that maybe we need to work on more as a society. Then this idea of puberty and adolescent moodiness. One of the original theorists who talked about adolescence and puberty and moodiness had said that adolescents go through a period of storm and stress. And the whole idea here was that adolescents are just really moody and like they're happy and then they're mad and there's conflict and it's all hormone driven. Well, we know today that that's not actually all that true. Sure, adolescents are moody. I mean, everybody's moody sometimes, right? But adolescents do tend to be more moody than children and more moody than adults. But it has less to do with hormones and more to do with activity shifts. So think about it. Think about when you were in elementary school. How many times did you change classrooms and people who you were with during the day? The answer is probably very little. You had your classroom, and you probably only left your classroom to go have lunch, to go to art class or music class or gym class, and maybe in some upper grades, things like languages or math, where things were different levels, right? So there were people who were in advanced math classes, people who were in remedial math classes, so you would leave for that. But by and large, you got to your classroom and you stayed in your classroom with the same kids all day. Now think about high school. You're all over the place. So you might be with your best friend in English. You might be with your worst enemy in homeroom. Then there's the guy who you like in your math class. There's the girl who you also like in biology, but she's lab partnered with someone who you don't like. And so, yeah, you're moody because you're all over the place during the day. And of course, adding cell phones and social media into that, constantly changing whether we're happy or not. Did my Instagram post get enough likes? Why is my mother insisting on following me on Instagram, right? Like things like that, those take a hit too. So we do see that adolescents are moody, but we think it has more to do with what goes on during their day than the hormones themselves. In terms of, oh, whoopsies. See, that's what I said this before, that whole getting ahead of myself thing. So adolescents are more moody than adults, but it's unlikely due to hormonal fluctuations. I really should look at my slides and my notes every now and then. Okay, in terms of puberty and changes in patterns of sleep, one of the things that we see is what we call the delayed phase preference. And so again, this is a very natural thing for adolescents as they enter into adolescence to start staying up later and later at night. And of course, if you stay up later at night, you want to sleep later in the morning. And so that's what's called this delayed phase preference. The problem is, most of our school systems don't accommodate that. Most of our school systems say, well, this is what time you have to start school. And that doesn't always work for adolescents. Adolescents would do much better starting school after 9 a.m., possibly even 10 a.m. or later, and going till later in the day. But we often, because of busing, because of extracurriculars, because of responsibilities to help take care of younger siblings, because of parents working, we often need to make sure that adolescents are out of high school at a pretty close to the same time or even before their younger siblings. And we see that adolescents are actually not going to school at their optimal times. And so they're staying up late, but then being forced to wake up early. And then you give an adolescent a weekend, and some of you may remember sleeping till noon or even 1 in the afternoon on weekends because you were probably up till 2 or 3 in the morning because that was what your body wanted. It wasn't you trying to be defiant. It wasn't you trying to be like, woohoo, I'm an adolescent, I can stay up late. It was your body saying, I'm not tired at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. In terms of family relationships, you heard that too? Okay. So in terms of family relationships, some of what we see is some increase of conflict and distance between adolescents and parents. This is fairly normal that we see. And it might be, from an evolutionary perspective, that part of this happens to make sure that kids are going to leave. So think about it for a minute. If everything's great at home with your parents, if you're getting along really well, if you're navigating all of the changes that life throws at you, what's your motivation to actually leave? It's got to be pretty low, right? You have somebody doing the cooking, somebody doing the cleaning, maybe if you're lucky, someone's doing your laundry. I know my parents, for my brother and I, it was like, I think when we were like 11 or 12, they were like, and now it's time to learn about laundry. And we had to start doing our own laundry at that stage, which is fine because, my mom was still going to the grocery store and doing the vast majority of the food prep. My responsibilities were laundry and keeping my room clean. I wish those were my only responsibilities today, but they're not. So that, from an evolutionary standpoint, parents want to make sure that their children are going to be able to leave the nest at some point, so to speak. So we see that happening. And typically, adolescents, as they get to the end of adolescence, get close with their parents again. So there's a natural distancing, there's a natural sense of conflict. Adolescents, we're going to talk about this later in the term, are discovering who they are. They're pushing for independence and autonomy. Parents, of course, don't want to let their kids grow up. They worry about what might happen to them out in the real world. So we do see some of that conflict that goes on. The other thing that we want to just take a moment to consider is pubertal maturation and peer relationships. And the big thing here, of course, is that as we go through puberty, as we start developing our primary and secondary sex characteristics, as our brain starts going, oh, yeah, this is like an adult body, and suddenly I'm attracted to other adult bodies, we start to see the emergence of romantic relationships. So that's going to also, for people who are early maturers, they're more likely to enter into romantic relationships earlier, sometimes with similar aged peers who were also early maturing, but sometimes with older peers. So that's something we need to keep in mind. Okay, in terms of specific events, this one's going to maybe get a little uncomfortable for some of you, which is a good time for me to mention that, hey, if you're going to be working with adolescents in any capacity, you have to learn to be comfortable with the uncomfortable things. So for adolescent females, there's like 2 big specific events that happen. One is when an adolescent female or a pre-adolescent female starts to wear a bra. Some girls like to start wearing bras before there is even a remote need for a bra because their friends have started wearing bras. Bras become something that other people are aware of. They can see your bra straps, they can see the bra under your clothing. Sometimes boys and even other girls will try to snap a girl's bra straps, right? Like really pointing out that there's a bra being worn. So that's one thing that happens that certainly marks a stage of puberty. But the other big thing that happens for girls is the onset of menstruation. So what we call menarche, it's the first menses, and that's a pretty big deal for a lot of girls. A lot of times that, shifts things within a family. So maybe a girl and a brother are sharing a bedroom, and maybe once there's the onset of menstruation, that's not so comfortable anymore. So we might have to make a change there. In certain cultures, menstruation is treated as either something dirty and shameful, which there's really no reason for, it's just a natural biological process, or it's something to be celebrated. In some cultures, it could be that at the onset of menstruation, an adolescent girl is going to go through a more formal rite of passage, sort of entering into womanhood. So there are things for girls that are kind of big, and some of them are obvious to other people, some aren't. Menstruation, of course, is not going to be obvious to other people unless it happens unexpectedly and suddenly you've got blood between your legs and on your pants or on your chair or whatever. Or if, you need, like girls still today, there's like this secretive, like I have to go to the bathroom and change my tampon, but nobody can know that I'm carrying a tampon and that I'm going to, like, why? So there's actually been an interesting movement over the past few years of some women who have chosen to embrace this concept of free bleeding, where they don't use anything. They don't use tampons, they don't use pads, they don't use a menstrual cup to try to catch the blood, but they just walk around with their menstrual blood. And there was actually a woman running the London Marathon a few years ago who was a free bleeder, and you could see as she crossed the finish line. I'm not gonna lie, it's a little weird, but hey, more power to the people who say there's nothing shameful or dirty about periods, and we just have to get that out there. But what about boys? There's something specific that happens for boys, but isn't really talked all that much about. So this is where, again, things might start to feel a tiny, tiny titch uncomfortable, because let's talk about first menstruation versus first ejaculation. So we talk a lot about first menstruation. All of the females who are watching this will probably be able to think about that time that either in school or with a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an older sister who sat them down to have the talk that their body was going to start changing one day. And one day they would start bleeding. And there's nothing to be scared of, and this is what it is, right? But how many boys get sat down and are given the talk about ejaculation? We don't know, because nobody talks about it, right? So we don't know if this is happening, because adolescent boys don't really want to talk about the fact whether someone has sat down with them and talked to them about ejaculation. So what often happens is an adolescent male might discover that he is ejaculating quite by accident. It could be that he has what's known as a wet dream and then wakes up all sort of sticky and sort of is confused because like, I haven't wet the bed in like a long time, and this is kind of stickier than like bedwetting. It doesn't smell like pee either. And that's how they discover that, hey, the magic of ejaculation is upon them. Sometimes it's because they are masturbating because it feels good, but they've never ejaculated before, and now all of a sudden, hello, right? Like there's actually an ending that happens. So we don't know as much because nobody talks about it. And usually those conversations about ejaculation will happen between adolescent boys, but not usually with their parents. Certainly I'm trying to imagine an adolescent boy sitting down with a grandparent and being like, so, Can we talk about the fact that I think I just ejaculated for the first time? Like, I don't see that happening. And again, there's nothing shameful or wrong or dirty about ejaculation. That's part of what a male body is supposed to do as they're going through puberty. But again, we don't know a whole lot about how boys feel about it, and we certainly don't have a ceremony, right? So in some traditional cultures, there's a ceremony once a female begins menstruating. There certainly isn't an ejaculation ceremony, right? Although, funny story. So for a lot of years, I worked at overnight camp, and one year I was in charge of our counselor in training program, which was like 15-year-old adolescents. And so I lived in a cabin with the females, but obviously we couldn't have the males and females. So you didn't want to have males and females, 15-year-olds, living together in the woods of Maine in a cabin. So we had a male staff member living with the males, and they didn't really like him. And quite frankly, I was kind of okay with that because he was my ex-boyfriend. So I was like okay with them not really liking him. But one day when he had a day off, and so he had left camp, and the boys were still in the cabin, they decided to have what is called a circle jerk. And they all ejaculated on this guy's bed. And I had to discipline them. So that was kind of funny and interesting, and it was my first time. And again, here I was like 21 years old, and I'm now having to talk to 15-year-olds about why it's not okay to ejaculate on someone else's bed, which is not a conversation I ever anticipated having. I'm just going to put that out there. Okay, poor Ian, who's filming, is like dying right now. You have to get comfortable with the things that are uncomfortable. I love telling that story. It's one of my main motivations for teaching adolescents. Okay, so the impact of early or late maturation. Really what it comes down to is less about specifically whether you are early or late, but your perception of whether you're early or late. So if you are someone who has a lot of friends who are all maturing early, and you're maturing early, you don't think it's early because that's what's happening in your friend group. If, on the other hand, a lot of your friends are not even early, but like on time, but you're delayed, you will feel like you are a late maturer. Okay, so the perception is really important. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are some people who are going to have delayed puberty because of athletic activity, poor nutrition, things like that, genetics. So there might be some concerns. We typically would say if an adolescent girl hasn't had her first period by the age of 16, probably should get checked out by a medical doctor. Oftentimes there is nothing wrong and it's just going to happen when it happens, but it's always a good idea to get that checked out at that point. So if we think about early versus late maturation among boys, early maturers have more of a positive outcome. And this kind of makes sense. An early maturing boy is going to get taller earlier, is going to start looking like society's ideal for a male in terms of building up muscle mass, developing facial hair, deepening of the voice. And so an early maturing boy will often be pegged as a leader even if they have zero leadership qualities, because they just look older and more mature and more capable. Now we know that sometimes early maturing boys get into some trouble with drugs and alcohol because they look older, so they have more exposure, sometimes with sexual relationships when they aren't really quite ready. But generally, we see more positives for early maturing boys. Certainly, the tallest, strongest boy in the class is not likely to get picked on the way a late maturing boy might get picked on for being scrawny and still kind of looking a little bit like a girl. Again, why that's an insult, I don't know. But when we talk about girls, we go the other way. Maturing early is worse for girls. So we talked about the hit on self-esteem already. We talked about that aspect of gaining fat. We have talked a little bit about how periods are still something that, you know, people in some parts of the world think of as shameful or dirty and we can't talk about. And also, as girls become more mature, they become prey for older people in terms of sexual activity. We see higher rates of depression and anxiety and eating disorders in early maturing girls. So really not so good, okay? This is where I'm going to wrap up the formal part of the lecture. What you'll notice is in your text, there's another section on obesity and eating disorders that you are still expected to read, but don't obsess over it. So read it, have an understanding, but it's not, I don't think that's going to be the focus of our discussion, in large part because what I've heard from students over the years is they're so tired of talking about those things because they come up in every class. So, I also had mentioned at the beginning that there would be a video that you would be assigned to watch. And so before completing the quiz for the chapter and prior to coming to class, I want you to watch, it's on YouTube, it's called Period End of Sentence. It won an Academy Award a couple of years ago for Best Short Documentary. It's only 26 minutes long, so it's really not that long. It's a Netflix production, but it is on YouTube. It is freely accessible. And just be aware that there are subtitles as much of the spoken dialogue is not in English. So this is something that you probably don't want to plan on watching, having it like running in the background, because you're going to have to be reading the subtitles to understand what they're saying. But it's really, I don't know, I found it really powerful and I found it really connected to this, and I think we're just going to have some interesting discussion about it. So again, click the YouTube link and you should be all set. And then for your reflection, in one paragraph, maximum of 8 sentences, please share your thoughts on the documentary. You may find these questions helpful to guide you, but you are not required to answer them. So if you're just not sure where to start, you can use these questions as a guide. If you already have ideas about what you want to say, don't worry about it. You don't have to answer these, but were you surprised by the content? What was different about how menstruation is talked about in rural India compared to Canada? And why are periods still sort of taboo today? And that's the end of the chapter.